Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We are diving into a pretty complex situation today. It's the recent prisoner exchange between Hamas and Israel.
Right.
Now, this isn't just like a one-off event. This is a key part of a larger ceasefire agreement trying to kind of cool things down in the conflict. And,
Yeah.
and while we're going to, dig into the political side of it all, I also want to explore the human element here.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. We have female Israeli soldiers returning home after being held captive. We have Palestinian prisoners finally gaining their freedom after decades in some cases.
Yeah.
The emotional impact of that has got to be just massive.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating how this particular exchange kind of fits into the bigger strategy of de-escalation. I mean, you have to think about it. This isn't a simple ceasefire. It's actually very carefully structured.
Right.
You can almost think about it in phases, right? Phase 1, we have the prisoner exchange. That's happening right now.
Yeah.
That sets the stage for phase 2, which is
Deeper negotiations on the core issues driving the conflict. And then the ultimate goal, phase 3.
Okay.
Rebuilding Gaza.
right.
Establishing some kind of stable governance in Gaza. It's very fragile, but this structured approach
Yeah.
at least offers, a sliver of hope.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, to really even grasp what's happening here, I think we need to back up a little and kind of remind ourselves of the bigger picture. We're talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict,
Right.
which, as you know, flared up tragically again in October of 2023. And the human cost of this conflict is just staggering. We're talking over 47,000 Palestinians killed, over 111,000 wounded.
Yeah.
On the Israeli side, over 1,100 killed, and more than 200 captured.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember that, this isn't just about recent events. This conflict is rooted in decades
Absolutely.
of history, complex political claims from both sides.
Yeah.
Really deep-seated social divisions. Both sides have experienced immense suffering.
Which makes, finding a path to peace even harder.
Absolutely.
The ceasefire, however fragile it may be, is at least a chance
Right.
to break that cycle of violence.
Yeah, well, let's talk about these 4 Israeli soldiers who were released.
Yes.
Their names are Karina Ariev, Daniela Gilboa, Nama Levy, and Liri Albag. All of them were captured on October 7th, 2023, which was right at the beginning of that Hamas offensive. That means they spent over a year in captivity.
Yeah.
And their stories, I think, really help to put a human face on this very complex conflict.
Absolutely. And, their capture had a profound impact on the Israeli psyche. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about this feeling of vulnerability, right? You have these young people, many barely out of their teens, thrust into a conflict zone and then captured. It became a symbol of what was at stake.
Right.
It really intensified those calls for military action.
Well, take Karina Ariev, for instance. She was just 20 years old, from Jerusalem. She was stationed at the Nahal Oz Army Base near the Gaza border. Early on, when she was captured, Hamas released a photo of her.
Yeah.
She had a bandaged head. Her parents, understandably, they were desperate. They made sure that image stayed out there in the public eye.
Right.
It makes you think about how that pressure, that public pressure, the constant reminder of their daughter in captivity.
Yeah.
How did that impact these behind-the-scenes negotiations?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because it wasn't just about governments talking to governments, right?
Right.
It was about the emotional pressure from the families, the public outcry, this constant reminder of the human cost.
Yeah.
It really forced the Israeli government to prioritize the captives' release, even if it meant making concessions that, they might have resisted otherwise.
Right. And then there's Daniela Gilboa, who's also 20. She's from Petah Tikva. And she appeared in a video released by Hamas pleading for the Israeli government to secure their release.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have been like, the psychological toll of captivity, especially for these young women.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research on the psychological impact of captivity on soldiers, especially female soldiers. And it's really revealing. It goes beyond just the immediate trauma of being captured and confined.
Right.
These women face really unique challenges: isolation, the constant threat of violence, and the potential for exploitation and abuse.
Yeah.
And those after effects, they can be very long lasting.
Yeah.
You're talking PTSD, difficulty
Yeah.
reintegrating into society,
Yeah.
outgoing mental health struggles.
Yeah.
These women, they're going to need extensive support, specialized counseling. They need their communities to really understand what they've gone through to help them navigate this transition back to life outside of captivity.
Well, and it makes you think about the public perception of these soldiers as these symbols of strength and resilience.
Yeah.
I wonder how that might impact their own ability
Yeah.
to even admit their vulnerability and seek help.
That's a really interesting point because you're right. There is this expectation, especially for soldiers, to be strong and stoic.
Right.
But they need to acknowledge
Right.
their vulnerability, the trauma that they've experienced. That's key for them to heal.
Right.
And this is a conversation that needs to happen openly
Yeah.
within the military, but also in society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have Nama Levy, who was just starting her service when she was captured,
Right.
and Liry-Albag, who was reportedly in hiding during a rocket barrage when
Wow.
she was taken. I mean, their stories really highlight how deeply
Yeah.
this conflict can impact ordinary lives.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these women are not just names on a list.
Right.
They represent the human cost of this war.
Yeah.
The way that it just shatters even the most basic sense of security, of normalcy. Their experiences are a reminder, I think, that peace isn't just about some political agreement.
Right.
It's about creating a world where young people don't have to live in constant fear, where their lives aren't defined
Right.
by violence.
Right. Well, on the other side of this exchange, we have the release of 200 Palestinian prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of these individuals have been serving life sentences, which, raises a lot of really complex questions
Absolutely.
about justice and reconciliation in a conflict like this.
This release carries just enormous symbolic weight
Yeah.
for Palestinians. For many of them, these prisoners represent resistance to what they see as an oppressive occupation.
Right.
So their return is seen as a victory,
Yeah.
the sign that their struggle has not been forgotten.
Yeah.
It's a powerful affirmation of their collective identity.
Yeah, one case that really jumped out at me was Mohammed Al-Tus. He was the longest-serving Palestinian prisoner.
Wow.
He had spent 30 years in Israeli detention. His release, I mean, wow.
Yeah.
That must have been incredibly emotional, both for him,
Absolutely.
but also for Palestinians who really see him as a symbol of their struggle.
And I think his story really speaks to just how enduring this conflict is,
Right.
how deeply rooted it is
Yeah.
in history and lived experience. For a lot of Palestinians, he embodies that ongoing fight for self-determination, that yearning for a future free from what they see as Israeli control. So his release,
Right.
after 3 decades, it becomes this very powerful
Yeah.
symbol of resilience and hope.
Well, of course, this prisoner exchange has really provoked a very wide range of reactions. You see celebrations in Palestine, but also a lot of anger and resentment from some in Israel, and the Israeli government is trying to downplay the release as a victory for Hamas.
Yeah.
Clearly a very sensitive issue.
Right.
It exposes those deep divisions on both sides.
It's a reminder that any step towards peace in this conflict is going to be delicate,
Right.
fraught with difficult compromises that are going to trigger really strong emotions
Right.
on both sides. For some Israelis, releasing prisoners, especially those convicted of violent crimes, feels like a betrayal of justice, a threat to their security. And so the government's attempts to downplay it,
Yeah.
really reflect that internal pressure, the need to balance that desire for peace with those deep-seated fears.
Right. And it just shows how far apart the two sides are in terms of their narratives, their understanding of the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and speaking of controversial practices, we have to talk about administrative detention.
Right.
This is a practice that Israel uses to hold Palestinians indefinitely without any charge.
Yeah.
And it's been heavily criticized by human rights groups around the world.
Yeah, administrative detention is a real legal and moral quagmire.
Yeah.
It complicates any path to peace. Critics argue that it's a tool
that's used to silence dissent, control the Palestinian population. It bypasses due process, undermines basic human rights.
Right.
It fuels resentment, fuels mistrust.
Yeah.
It makes reconciliation that much harder.
Well, and while we're on the topic of human rights, we can't ignore these reports about the conditions that Palestinian prisoners face. We're talking overcrowding, limited clothing, exposure to the elements, and even accusations of rape and abuse.
Those are really disturbing reports. They raise serious questions about the treatment of prisoners in this conflict?
Well, it feels like we've just kind of scratched the surface here, and yet there's so much complexity already.
Absolutely. I mean, this prisoner exchange is like a microcosm of the conflict itself.
Yeah.
You know, a tangle of political maneuvering, deeply personal stories, moral questions.
Right.
It forces us to confront this reality that achieving peace here
Yeah.
is not going to be simple.
It's not just about signing agreements. It's not just about releasing prisoners.
Right.
It's about a fundamental shift in attitudes, a willingness to really acknowledge the other side's pain, and a genuine commitment to building a future based on mutual respect and understanding.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
This prisoner exchange, while significant, is just one step on a very long and uncertain road.
Yeah.
I mean, what does this tell us about the future of this ceasefire?
Right.
About the prospects for peace in the region?
Yeah.
That's a great question. We're going to find out after the break.
Well, it's a step forward,
Yeah.
but it's one that's surrounded by a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
I mean, this ceasefire, it faces huge challenges.
Yeah.
You have this deep distrust between Hamas and Israel.
Yeah.
You have complex political realities on both sides that just make compromise incredibly difficult.
Right.
And then you have this very delicate role of the international mediators who are trying to navigate this minefield and find some common ground.
Right. And then, I mean, and then just on a personal level, this exchange has to have just a massive impact.
Oh, absolutely.
Psychologically. I mean, not just for the individuals involved, but for both societies.
Yeah. For Israelis, seeing those soldiers return, particularly the women, it evokes this wave of emotions, relief, joy, but also this lingering sense of vulnerability.
Right.
It's a reminder that even in a society with a strong military,
Yeah.
individuals can still be targets.
Right.
And that has a profound impact, I think, on the national psyche.
And I mean, it raises some tough questions, too, about, you know, the government's responsibility to protect its citizens.
Right.
About the price of security, about the long-term effects, the trauma these soldiers are going to carry.
Absolutely.
How do they process this?
Right.
How do they even reintegrate into everyday life?
It's a very complex journey,
Yeah.
and it's one that's going to require a lot of support. You know, we know that former prisoners of war, they often struggle with PTSD, anxiety, depression, all those things, and it's just really hard for them to readjust.
Right.
And for these women, you have that added layer of public scrutiny, this expectation that they should be strong, and it could make it even harder for them to actually seek help and to process what they've been through.
And then on the Palestinian side, I mean, the release of these prisoners, some of whom have been in prison for years.
Yeah.
This has got to feel like a huge symbolic victory.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it reinforces that narrative of resistance,
Yeah.
of standing up to what they perceive as this oppressive force.
Right.
And it strengthens that sense of collective identity, the solidarity.
Right.
They're in this together, and their resilience is ultimately going to lead to freedom.
But it's not a simple celebration, is it?
No, not at all.
There are still so many Palestinians
Exactly.
in Israeli prisons, many of whom are held under administrative detention, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
This release, while significant, is still just one small step.
It is.
And a much larger.
It's a drop in the bucket, really, compared to the thousands that are still detained.
Yeah.
And the continued use of administrative detention just fuels that resentment and distrust because it undermines any sense of fairness or due process, and it makes genuine reconciliation that much harder.
It's a constant reminder that these legal and moral complexities, they run very deep.
They do.
And then there's the issue of the conditions inside these prisons. We're talking about overcrowding, inadequate medical care, lack of basic necessities.
Those are incredibly concerning reports.
Yeah.
And they raise serious questions about the humane treatment of prisoners, regardless of their affiliations or alleged crimes.
Absolutely.
Those conditions should meet international standards, and there needs to be accountability for any violation.
Well, we can't shy away from the most serious allegations here.
Right.
The reports of abuse and even rape that have been documented by human rights groups.
Those reports are horrific.
Yeah.
They demand a thorough and independent investigation because the treatment of prisoners, regardless of the circumstances, reflects a society's values. Turning a blind eye to these abuses erodes trust.
Right.
And it just makes any talk of peace or reconciliation ring hollow.
It's a reminder that peace building requires so much more than just ceasefires and prisoner exchanges.
It does.
It requires a commitment to justice, to human rights,
Absolutely.
recognizing the dignity of all the people involved.
You're absolutely right. It requires a fundamental shift in mindset, a willingness to move beyond that cycle of retribution and fear.
So if we zoom back out a little bit,
Yeah.
what does this prisoner exchange tell us about the bigger picture?
Right.
Does it offer any real hope for this ceasefire to succeed, for a lasting peace in the region?
Ooh, it's a glimmer, a glimmer of hope, but a very fragile one.
Right.
And we have to remember, this exchange is just one piece of a much larger puzzle, right?
Right.
The success of this ceasefire really hinges on so many factors.
Right.
The willingness of both sides to compromise.
Yeah.
The ability of those international mediators to bridge those divides.
Yeah.
And probably most importantly, a shift in public opinion toward a desire for peace.
Right. It really feels like this exchange is like this microcosm of the whole conflict.
Yeah.
This tangle of hope and despair, celebration and resentment.
It's a perfect analogy because you have families that are reunited with their loved ones after years of separation. I mean, they're experiencing this immense joy, relief.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have people who see the release of these prisoners as a concession to terrorism, a bitter pill to swallow.
Right.
And the challenge here
is, can you channel those raw emotions, both the positive and the negative, into a constructive dialogue, into a search for some kind of common ground?
Yeah. And meanwhile, the international community is watching all this very closely, trying to figure out what it all means. I mean, is this real progress? Or is this just another temporary pause in the fighting? And what's their role in all of this?
It's tough. They're walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
They're trying to facilitate dialogue.
Yeah.
They want to nudge both sides toward compromise.
Right.
But they can't be seen as taking sides or imposing solutions.
Right.
So it's a delicate dance.
Yeah.
It requires a deep understanding of all those historical complexities, the political sensitivities, the emotions at play.
Yeah. And as you said, I mean, public opinion is huge.
It's crucial.
How this exchange is perceived by everyday Israelis and Palestinians, I mean, that could really make or break the whole peace process.
Absolutely. If this is seen as a humiliating defeat for one side,
or a cynical ploy by the other, it could backfire very easily.
Yeah.
It could harden positions and make future negotiations even more difficult. But if it's seen as a genuine gesture of good faith, a sign that both sides are willing to compromise, then it could actually create momentum for more dialogue and reconciliation.
So much comes down to perception. The narratives that take hold.
It's a reminder that peace building isn't just about political agreements. It's about changing hearts and minds.
Absolutely. It's about shifting that narrative away from victimhood and blame and moving towards one of shared humanity.
Exactly.
Recognizing that both sides have suffered. Both sides have legitimate grievances. And ultimately, I think both sides really yearn for a future where their kids can live in peace. It's a tall order, for sure.
It is.
But, this prisoner exchange, it's at least cracked open a door. It's created some space for new possibilities, for a conversation that goes beyond the kind of entrenched rhetoric of the past.
I think that is the key takeaway here. This exchange is not a solution in itself. It's a starting point, right? It's a chance to see each other not just as enemies, but as human beings with families and hopes and fears, with a shared desire for something better.
That's a powerful thought to end on. This deep dive has been a real journey.
It has.
I mean, through so many layers of complexity, from the geopolitical maneuvering to the really personal stories of the people affected by this conflict. And it really leaves us with that question, what happens next?
That is the question we should all be asking.
What does the future hold for this ceasefire, for the peace process, and ultimately for the people of Israel and Palestine?
Exactly.
And maybe, even more importantly, what role can each of us play in supporting a more peaceful future for this region? It's a challenge.
It is.
But it demands our attention, our empathy, our engagement.
It does.
I think we can start by staying informed, by challenging our own biases.
Absolutely.
By looking for diverse perspectives. And by supporting those organizations that are actually working for peace and reconciliation. even small actions, right?
Yeah.
Multiplied across communities,
Mm-hmm.
across nations, that can create a real ripple effect.
Absolutely.
It can contribute to a change in consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
a movement toward a world where peace isn't just a dream,
Right.
but a reality.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive
It's been a pleasure.
into the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's a conversation that's got to continue, we know that.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope you'll join us again as we explore more
Yes.
of these pressing issues
Absolutely.
that are shaping our world. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a more just and peaceful world.